السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. In today's lesson, we're not going to be doing the kitab, we're going to be explaining the Hanafī approach to seemingly contradict. In the previous lessons, we done what Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned, how Muhaddithun and Shafi'is and the other Malikis and Hanbalis, how they would approach reports and Ḥadīth which seemingly contradicted each other. So now to point out the Hanafī madhab, but before we even start, I can tell you that prepare yourself for a very confusing lesson, because we're going to be going in a zigzag, and you might even see some contradictions, but at the end you'll understand the conclusion. So before even continuing, please understand that this here is a chapter of Usulul Fiqh. So each of these three steps which Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned, they are governed by numerous principles. There are laws how to make jama'ah. So here it's so simple, just mention that you combine the report. But when you open from Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, you will find that there were laws on how to make jama'ah. Then there are laws regarding nasakh, and also the different ways, what's going to be valid for tarjih, etc. And we mentioned in the last lesson that Ulama Iraqi mentioned 100 ways, but now how to give preference from these different ways. What if you get to contradictory reasons? So you get one reason to give preference to this report, but then you get another reason to give preference to the other report. So all that, it's a whole long, lengthy discussion, and that's all for Usulul Fiqh. Now, because we have the deadline of this year, we said we'll complete this kitab by December, so it is not possible for us to discuss all these different laws, that we only have now 86 lessons left. In the beginning of the year, we said 95, so now we have 86 lessons left to complete the kitab, so we can only dedicate this particular session, this half an hour, to discussing the Hanafī madhab, and from the next lesson we have to continue with the kitab, and that is why I said it might be a bit confusing. So in the last lesson we concluded the lesson mentioning the approach of Imam Tahawi rahimahullah, that when he came across two seemingly contradictory narrations, then how he would look at them. But we said that within the Hanafī madhab, we first look at an-Naḍar. We first try to see that how can we say that there is no contradiction at all. Only after that, then we come to the steps of reconciliation. So we first see that can we say that there is no contradiction between these two reports. If we can say that there is no contradiction between the two reports, then we don't even come to the steps which are going to be mentioned, because it means there is no tadad, there is no contradiction. But now, although we started the discussion with Imam Tahawi in the last lesson, when thinking, that now you have to present it. So when thinking of how I can present the views in a way which is easier to understand, I thought rather we discuss the Hanafī madhab from another angle. So we fast forward and we see the views of other scholars beyond Imam Tahawi rahimahullah. So if you have the kitab, دراسات في أصول الحديث على منهج الحنفية of Abdul Majid al-Tarkumani, then if you open to page 499, so you will see here he mentions three different views. So the first view is, he says, المذهب الأول السبيل فيه أن يرجع إلى التاريخ أولا فإن علم المتأخر والمتقدم فالمتأخر ناسخ للمتقدم وإن جهل التاريخ فإن كان أحدهما راجحا فيؤخذ به ويرد المرجوح ثم يجمع بينهما إن أمكن وإلا قررت الأصول. So what he is saying, that according to one group of scholars, that when you find two seemingly contradictory reports, now he didn't mention this one point here, but remember it and always keep it in the back of your mind, that first you try to see how can we say that there is no contradiction between the two. But after you agree that there is contradiction, now these are the steps to follow. That the first is nasakh, that you will see which is nasikh and which is mansukh. So this is differing from what Ibn Hajar mentioned, because Ibn Hajar mentions first is jama'ah, and he is mentioning first is nasakh. Then it's tarjih. So what Ibn Hajar mentioned as the third step, he's mentioning as the second step. Then ثم الجمع, that what Ibn Hajar mentioned as the first step, he's mentioning it as the third step. ثم تقرير الأصول. So it's نسخ, tarjih, جمع, تقرير الأصول. No مخلص من التضاد. So now we will first see نسخ, that the one is nasikh and the other is mansukh. Then if that is not possible, then we give tarjih to the one over the other. If that is not possible, then only we combine the two reports. And if that is not possible, then we go to taqreerul usul. We look at different usul which the Hanafi fuqaha have laid down. So the point to note here is that look at the names of the scholars who he's mentioning who had this view. He's saying وَهَذَا رَأْيُ الْمُحَقِّقُ ابْنُ الْهُمَّامِ. Now Ibn al-Humam, he was born in the year 790 and he passed away in the year 861. So it's all latter-day scholars who came so late. Then he's saying وَاخْتَارَهُ Ibn Amir al-Hajj wa Amir Badsha, all scholars who came 800, 900 years, so late scholars. But that's the point to keep in mind. So this is the first group of scholars. Then the second view is, he mentions that يحمل على النسخ إن علم المتقدم من المتأخر وإن لم يعمل وأمكن التوفيق بينهما فيجمع وإن لم يمكن قررت الأصول. So according to this view, is that first is naskh. So they're the same like those scholars who had the first view. The first step is when you find and you are convinced that there are two reports which are contradicting each other, then the first is you look for nasikh, and which will be the mansukh. If that is not possible, then according to the second view, you immediately now try to combine the two reports. According to the first view, you first give preference to the one over the other. But according to this view, you immediately combine and then you go to taqreerul usul. So the second view is naskh, jama' and taqreerul usul. Now again, this here is a view which is quoted from scholars of the 8th century and later. That Alauddin al-Bukhari, he mentions Mukhtarahu al-Bukhari, meaning Alauddin al-Bukhari, 730, and then Satr al-Sharia, etc. So again, it's latter-day scholars who had this view. Now it is clear from these two views, which we just mentioned from the Hanafis, is that there is a completely different sequence from what Ibn Hajar rahmallah 501 year of the Rasat. Now he mentions the third view and he says that al-hukmu fihi al-jam'u in amkana. So exactly the same like what Ibn Hajar mentioned. The first step is you try to see how you can combine the two reports. ثم النسخ إن عرف المتقدم من المتأخر. Again, following what Ibn Hajar said, after Jama, you then look if you can find which one is nasikh and which one is mansukh. ثم ترجيح, 100% what Ibn Hajar says, and ثم التوقف. So this third view is definitely the same like what Ibn Hajar rahmallah, the way it's being mentioned here is definitely the same like what Ibn Hajar rahmallah just mentioned. And this here again starts from the students of Ibn Hajar rahmahullah. So you will find he mentions the name of Alama Shumunni rahmallah was the student of Ibn Hajar. So obviously following his ustad, following Ibn Hajar rahmahullah, he took the same approach. So these are three different views within the Hanafi madhab. But now the problem comes about that if these three views are mentioned, then depending on which view you're going to take, it's going to cause so many differences in how you practice upon the ahkam of Sharia. Because we know that what is the main reason that there is a difference in how Hanafis practice upon Islam and how Shafi'is practice. It is because of apparent contradiction in the different reports. So the apparent contradiction between different ahadith, it is that which causes so many differences between the different mazahib. And then the differences is how we look at these different reports, the usul which we place down in looking at this report. So this is how each mazhab is also convinced that they are practicing upon a hadith. If you ask the Shafis, they would say, we are the ones who are practicing upon the hadith. If you guys are Ahlul Rai, you are not practicing upon the hadith. But once you open the Hanafi fiqh books, you will find that our action is also backed with a hadith, which contradicts the proof of the Shafi'is. So the main cause for differences amongst the four madhahib is because of a hadith which seemingly contradicted each other. Now, if you are going to say And it reminds me that, Allama Khalid Mahmoud, rahmallah, when he came to Darul Ulum Azad practice in the Haram, that whenever you perform a salah as a Hanafi, especially if you're performing next to an Arab, then after the salah, he will quote to you a hadith, in the Haram that they read the Janazah salah. So if you make 2 salams, then he would quote to you a hadith and told you that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam only made 1 salam. Or for some action or the other, they would quote to you a hadith and try to tell you that how you just performed your salah is not in conformity with the way Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam performed his salah. So Allama Khalid Mahmoud said that now you're in the Haram, why you want to debate with them? The simple thing you must ask them is, once they go to you a hadith, you don't have to now give them a different hadith or anything. Just tell them, is that the only hadith which is narrated on the subject? So immediately they will, if either they know or they don't know. If they know, they will definitely tell you that no, it's not the only hadith. So if it's not the only hadith, you are practicing on the one hadith and we are practicing on the other hadith. And if they don't know, then they can't say anything because there is definitely contradictory reports. And that you just open Sunan Abi Dawud or open Sunan Tirmidhi, then it is filled with contradictory reports which are mentioned all together, one after the other. That the hadith of Raf'ul Yadayn come immediately after it, the hadith of not making Raf'ul Yadayn come. So if you are going to take these 3 different approaches within the Hanafi madhab, it's going to mean that there are so many differences within the Hanafi madhab itself. It inevitably, that definitely it's going to lead, because if you're going to say that no, we can't make a nasr, if we have to make jama'ah, and if another person say no, that the one narration is a nasr, so when you are making jama'ah, you are practicing on both. But the other one is saying, no, it's nasikh, it's cancelling the other report. So it means now we are not practicing upon that other report. So it's going to lead to so many differences. For example, if you have to see the narration of Raf'ul Yadayn, now you can either say that the Prophet ﷺ made Raf'ul Yadayn, he raised his hands before ruku and after ruku for some salahs, and for other salahs he did not do it. In this way you are combining the 2 narrations. You are making jama'ah between, because salah obviously it's performed so often, so many times in one day. Likewise, if you see the differences in performing salah when it's ghalas, when it's still dark, to perform a fajr when it's still dark. But then if you look at the Hanafis, asfiru bil fajr fa innahu a'zamu lil ajr. So we perform fajr when it becomes a bit more light outside, besides the month of Ramadan. In the month of Ramadan, we also qail of ghalas, and likewise in Hajj. So if you look at if you want to make jama'ah, you can say sometimes Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam performed when it was dark, and sometimes he performed when it was light. You can even then attribute it to season, etc. But if you are saying nasikh and mansukh, or even if you're giving tarjih one over the other, then it means you are always going to be practicing upon isfar. So can you see how the different approach is going to lead to different actions within the Hanafi madhab? Likewise, take misl awwal and misl thani, that when does asr time set in? Are you going to take jama'ah or are you going to take nas? And based on that, so it's going to lead to so many different ways of interpreting these ahadith, because all these ahadith are of such ahkam which are practiced on a daily basis. And now we are showing that there are 3 different approaches within the Hanafi madhab. So that's the one point which to keep in mind, that we have 3 views which are being quoted in the Hanafi madhab from latter-day scholars. But if you're going to take and you're going to look at these 3 differences, then it's going to lead to lots of differences within the Hanafi madhab. But when we look at it, that there is not so many differences within the Hanafi madhab. So that's the one point to keep in mind. Then the second point to keep in mind is that it's whose duty it is to inspect all these contradictory reports. It is the duty of the mujtahid. And within the Hanafi madhab, now whether it's acceptable or not acceptable, all that is a different discussion. But for our purpose here, within the Hanafi madhab, you have the 7 categories. So mujtahid mutlaq, mujtahid fil masail, mujtahid fil madhab, etc. So it's the mujtahid's duty. They were the ones who had to look at all these contradictory reports and then tell us the ahkam which will be derived from these reports. So if it was their duty to do this, then we know the mujtahidun were in the earlier part of the madhab. So how is it that it's the latter-day scholars who are telling us how to approach these contradictory reports? So those are keeping in mind. So the summary until here is that how can scholars within our madhab, within the one madhab itself, the Hanafi madhab, differs on the root, which is going to have a direct impact on how we practice upon our deen. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, how can such scholars tell us the principles who themselves would not be applying the principle, rather they would be following others. So now, keeping those 2 points in mind, we understand that actually all these views are derived from the methodology of earlier scholars. So whether you are taking the first view of saying naskh, thumma tarjih, thumma al-jam', thumma taqrir al-usul, although it's latter-day scholars who are mentioning it, but these latter-day scholars are deriving it from earlier scholars. So whether you are taking the second view of naskh and then jama' and then taqrir al-usul, again it's being derived from the methodology of earlier scholars. So now it all depends on which lenses you put on. Depending on which lenses you put on, that is how you are going to view the principles, and that is how you are going to derive these laws. So for example, the third group, they say that you should combine the two reports. Now, there are enough statements of Imam Tahawi rahimahullah which very clearly and emphatically tell us that we should combine the two reports. And Imam Tahawi is following the Hanafi, and actually he's so close to the era, the student of the students of Imam Muhammad. So he's like a third or fourth generation from the Imam of the Madhab. And he's going to be telling us how to approach these different ahadith. So now he is mentioning so many different times in his kitab that we should always first make jama'ah. So he says, فَأَوْلَى الْأَشْيَاء بِنَا أن تحمل هذه الروايات كلها على الاتفاق لا على التضاد. So this he mentions, he's saying that the best thing, and also he's mentioning all of these at the time of application, that he's in front of us we have the seemingly contradictory ahadith. And I'm not going to go into examples because, like I said, we are only dedicating this session. So he's saying فأولى الأشياء بنا أن تحمل هذه الروايات كلها على الاتفاق لا على التضاد. He mentions that والأولى بنا في هذه الآثار لما جاءت هذا المجيء أن نحملها ونخرج وجوهها على الاتفاق لا على الخلاف، فنجعل التأخير المكروه فيها هو ما بينه العلاء عن أنس، ونجعل الوقت المستحب من وقتها يصلى فيه هو ما بينه أبو الأبيض عن أنس. So you can see again he's saying that let us try to combine the two reports. We're saying that the one is referring to a time which is makruh, that means the salah will still be valid, and the other is on a time which is mustahab. In both instances the salah is still valid, but it's just referring to different times, so to show us permissibility basically. In this way we are combining the two reports. And another place, so maybe, like I said, there are so many different examples, just to mention 3-4. He says, Imam Tahawi is saying, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ عَنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم في هذه الآثار أنه قرأ في العيدين والجمعة غير ما جاء عنه في الآثار الأول، لم يجوز أن يحمل ذلك على التضاد والتكاذب، ولكن نحمله على الاتفاق والتصادق. You can see that there's different of how Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam what he recited in Jum'ah and what he recited in Eid prayer. So he's saying that let's combine all of these. And then he says, فَنَجْعَلُ ذَلِكَ كُلُّ قَدْ كَانَ مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. That we say all of it is from Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فَقَرَأَ بِهَذَا مَرَّةً وَبِهَذَا مَرَّةً. So this is what he's saying. But now he's mentioning this here as a principle. Like I say, that we know that it's a principle which is not being applied for our 5 daily salahs. At another place he says, وَهَذَا يَنْبَغِي أَن يُخْرَجَ عَلَيْهِ الْآثَارُ وَيُحْمَلَ عَلَى الاتفاق مَا قَدَرَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ وَلَا يُحْمَلَ عَلى التضاد إِلَّا أَلَّا يُوجَدْ لَهَا وَجْهٌ غَيْرُهُ. So this here he mentions. And then one more statement of his, and then we move on. He says at another place, وَأَوْلَى الْأَشْيَاء بِنَا أَن يُحْمَلَ الْآثَارَ عَلَى مَا فِيهِ اتِّفَاقُهَا وَتَصْحِيحُهَا لَا عَلَى مَا فِيهِ تَنَافِيهَا وَتَضَادُّهَا، فيكون معنى الحديثين أولين على ما وصفنا حتى لا يضاد معناهما هذا الحديث. So you can see it took me 3 minutes to mention all these different views from him, but to get these different views from him took hours and hours and hours, but obviously you have to read the whole kitab. Nevertheless, from these statements, you can see it seems that we just combine the two reports, because Imam Tahawi is saying that it's the best thing to do And in that first, in that one statement, he said, "Lam yajuz an yuhmala dhalika ala at-tadad." It's not even permissible to say. He's saying it's not even permissible to say that there is a contradiction. So this here then can become the basis for the third view, isn't? Because they are saying that you make Jama'ah and they have clear and emphatic statements from Imam Tahawi rahimahullah. Leave alone Imam Tahawi, then you can go to, because Imam Tahawi wrote in Ahkam. Look at the next scholar who also wrote in Ahkam, Ibn Jassas al-Razi rahimahullah. So in his Ahkam al-Quran, he mentions the exact same principle. وَمَتَى أَمْكَنَ اسْتِعْمَالُهَا مَعَ فَرْضِ الزَّكَاةِ فَغَيْرُ جَائِزٍ. Look at this thing. فَغَيْرُ جَائِزٍ الْحُكْمُ بِنَسْخِهَا. You cannot go to the second step of saying that it's mansukh. But I quoted to you now two views within the Hanafi madhab, which are saying that you start off with nas. But he's saying that فَغَيْرُ جَائِزٍ الْحُكْمُ بِنَسْخِهَا. وَكَذَلِكَ حُكْمُ سَائِرِ الْآيَاتِ متى أمكن الجمع بين جميعها في أحكامها من غير إثبات نسخ لها لم يجز لنا الحكم بنسخ شيء منها. So he's saying that as long as we can combine all these different reports, we cannot say that we cannot go to the next step of nas. But two groups and such a great amount of scholars within the Hanafi madhab, and in the Rasat you'll see that even our latter-day scholars, he quotes Mullah Shabir Ahmad Uthmani, he quotes all our latter-day scholars, they are mentioning that we start off with nas, but here they saying فَغَيْرُ جَائِزٍ الْحُكْمُ بِنَسْخِهَا. So now to understand all of this here, we go to the student of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah is Isa bin Aban. And as we concluded the last session, we said that it is governed by a very important law. And that is, we first need to look at the practice of earlier scholars, and then we can resort to combining. In Al-Fusul it is mentioned, وَقَدْ ذَكَرَ عِيسَى بْنُ أَبَانَ حكم الخبرين المتضادين فجعل أحد الأسباب المقوية لأحدهما وجود عمل الناس دون الآخر فيكون المعمول ثابت الحكم ناسخا. Now look, he's saying that we look at the actions of Sahaba and Tabi'in. But now what did Ibn Hajar rahmallah say here on page 79, the first line? وَأَمَّا الْإِجْمَاعُ فَلَيْسَ بِنَاسِخٍ بَلْ يَدُلُّ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. He's saying that ijma is not nasikh. What Isa bin Aban is saying here, فَيَكُونُ الْمَعْمُولُ ثَابِتَ الْحُكْمُ نَاسِخًا وَالْآخَرُ مَنْسُوخًا إِنْ صَحَّتِ الْأَصْلُ. So here, he's saying that we look at the practice, and then that practice can metaphorically be called a nasikh, because ijma laysa bi nasikh. So, and we explained it, that after the era of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, after Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam passed away, there is no nasikh. But he is saying, فَيَكُونُ الْمَعْمُولُ ثَابِتَ الْحُكْمُ نَاسِخًا وَالْآخَرُ مَنْسُوخًا إِنْ صَحَّتْ فِي الْأَصْلِ رِوَايَتُهُ. And only after that, so he's saying that we will regard the first one as nasikh and the second one as mansukh. So now the first two groups, they look at the fact that he used the term nas. So he's calling it nasikh, even though he's calling it metaphorically. But the first step they saying is nas, because he's clearly mentioning فَيَكُونُ الْمَعْمُولُ, and a direct student of Imam Muhammad. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah is the one who approached all these seemingly contradictory reports for us. So when he is calling it nas, so that's how they are saying that we start off with nas. Can you see how they're saying that we start off with nas? Because he's saying that the actions of Sahaba denote upon nas, so he's calling it metaphorically, he's calling it nasikhan wal akhar mansukhan. The third group, they are looking at it that no, these are the actions of Sahaba, they are not really nasikh. So they are saying that this step here of looking at the actions is actually the step before concluding that the two narrations are contradictory. You know, we spoke makhlas min at-tadad, that Hanafis have a approach of first making makhlas min at-tadad. Makhlas min at-tadad means we first try to say that there is no tadad between the two riwayah, that there is no contradiction between the two riwayah. Only after that we come now to the steps of reconciling. The step of makhlas min at-tadad is you look at the actions. So now we can understand how it's all becoming lafzi ikhtilaf in the Hanafi madhab. That the first two groups, when they are saying that it's nas, they are referring to actions of Sahaba and Tabi'un. The third group, they are saying no, those actions of Sahaba and Tabi'un cannot be called nas. So that is why they are starting with Jama'ah. But before starting with Jama'ah, they are looking at makhlas min at-tadad. That you only come to Jama'ah once it is established that there is contradiction. The step before establishing whether there is contradiction or not is to see the action. If there is ijma', then you don't even come to contradiction. So it's becoming a lafzi ikhtilaf, isn't that they are saying that you're starting with nas, meaning that you are starting with nas, looking at the ijma' of Sahaba. So now Imam Tahawi rahmallah and Ibn Jassas Razi rahmallah, both of them were Hanafis, and hence they are bound to follow this law which is mentioned by the direct student of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah. So we quoted Allama Jassas Razi's statement from Ahkam al-Quran. Now look at his commentary in Al-Fusul. He says, جعل عيسى استعمال الناس لأحد الخبرين موجبا لثبوت حكمه دون الآخر لأن الإجماع حجة. So you can see that so basically what these first two groups are calling nas, the other group can call it ijma'. So it's becoming a whole lafzi ikhtilaf in this way. ولا يجوز اجتهاد الرأي معه فالخبر الذي ساعده الإجماع منها ثابت الحكم والآخر إما أن يكون منسوخا أو غير ثابت في الأصل. So this is how he is mentioning it. And then he's clearly saying that the next step after establishing that there is no ijma'. So it is that وأما إذا اختلفوا فاستعمل بعضهم الآخر ساغ الاجتهاد في استعمال أحدهما فيكون ما عاضده شواهد الأصول أولى بالاستعمال. Then Isa bin Aban, he continues by saying فإن وجدناهم يجوزون للذين عملوا بالآخر ولا يعتبون عليهم ذلك جاز اجتهاد الرأي في ذلك وإن وجدناهم يعيبون ما ذهب إليه من خالفهم كان الأمر عندنا على ما عمل الناس وظهر في أيديهم. Then he's mentioning now examples after the statement. Now the scale nahyi an luhum al-adahi, if you look at that example where Ibn Hajar come back now to the Shafi'i madhab, to go back to the text here. Ibn Hajar rahmallah, when talking about nas, he said أصرحها ما ورد في النص كحديث بريدة في صحيح مسلم كنت نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزوروها فإنها تذكر الآخرة. Immediately after the statement here comes the statement of luhum al-adahi. So even though Ibn Hajar rahmallah is mentioning that the first step is we combine two reports, and then the second step is that we come to nas, you can tell me that if there is Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is clearly telling you that this ruling is cancelled, do you think Shafi'is would then go and say, no, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is saying that it's cancelled, but we are still not going to regard it as an abrogation because we first need to look at Jama'ah? No, obviously Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is clearly telling you that it is abrogated, so it's abrogated, finish. Whether and there are so many examples of this here that so Shafi'is will also accept that it is abrogated, and that is in Ḥadīth. He mentioned the Quran, so telling you that a law is totally cancelled. So Shafi'is also then would follow that and would say that okay. So although Ibn Hajar rahmallah is mentioning it here as a second step, you're understanding, or the point which I'm trying to show is that these steps which Ibn Hajar mentions are not cast in stone. At the time of application, different steps could be followed. So now you will find Shaykh Wahba Zuhaili in his kitab on Usul al-Fiqh, he mentioned that you first go to Jama'ah and then Tarjih and then Nas. He's a Shafi'i, so he's mentioning Jama'ah and then Tarjih, but Ibn Hajar mentioned Jama'ah and then Nas and then thirdly Tarjih. So it all depends on how you look at it. So technically, if you really wanted to go strictly by the book, Ibn Hajar rahmallah ought to mention the different steps like this here. That we first, when we find two contradictory reports, we first have to see if there's a clear mention in Quran or Hadith that one of them is later or not. If it's clearly mentioned, then we practice upon the one which is later. Secondly, we look if there's ijma' or not. If there's ijma', then we practice upon that. Thirdly, we see if we can combine. Fourthly, we see how it would now create a whole tangle up, so to say, that you're starting with Nas, mentioning Jama'ah, then mentioning Nas again. So the same is in the Hanafī madhab. Depending how you look at it, you're going to get different steps. You're going to say first there's Nas. Why? Because you are looking at a clear indication from Quran. Then you're going to say second step is again Nas, because you have to look at Ijma'. Then you're looking at Jama'ah. Then you're looking at again Nas. Then you're looking at Tarjih. So like we're saying that the latter-day Usuliyun, they presented the usul differently, but in practice it all comes back to the same. Now time is up, but I quickly try to mention all of these here just so that we can complete it. That looking at this principle, let me first look at the principle. So Imam Tahawi rahmallah would also practice a lot, he would also pay a lot of attention to the one narrating the hadith. So if the one narrating the hadith practiced upon something else in contrast to what he practiced upon, then he would immediately, from the very beginning, without even looking at combination. We quoted so many statements of his, and I didn't even quote to you all the statements. It was just about 5 statements I quoted to you, where he's saying that you first try to combine the 2 reports. But you will find so many times in, and you done the kitab, Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, so many times, to give you 3 random quotations. فهذا ابن عباس قد روى عن علي عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ما قد رويناه في أول هذا الباب وروى عنه عطاء بن يسار عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كما رويناه في الفصل الثاني من هذا الباب ثم عمل هو بذلك وترك ما حدثه علي رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فهذا دليل على أنه على نسخ ما روي عن علي رضي الله عنه, something like that. So basically, the minute he found the 2 contradictory reports, he looked at the action of the Sahabi. He didn't look at how we could combine the 2 reports. Again, looking at another statement of his in Sharh Mushkil al-Athar, he said, فَكَانَ فِي هَذَا الْحَدِيث مِنْ قَوْلِ أُمِّ سَلَمَ لِلْمَرْأَةِ الَّتِي سَأَلَتْهَا عَمَّا سَأَلَتْهَا عَنْهُ في هذا الحديث لا تفعلي ذلك إلا لما لا بد منه وقد سمعت من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ما يخالف فاستحال أن يكون كان ذلك منها إلا وقد نسخه من قبله صلى الله عليه وسلم لأنها رضي الله عنها مأمونة على ما قالت كما كانت مأمونة على ما روت. So you can see, he's saying that it's impossible. How can a Sahabi tell you something in contrast to what they mentioned? Another statement, فكان قول ابن عباس وعائشة هذا دليلا على أنهما قالا ما قالا فيما رويناه عنهما في هذه الآثار والحكم عندهما فيما قالاه في ذلك ما قالاه فيه ولا يجوز أن يكون ذلك منهما إلا بعد ثبوت نسخ ما سمعاه من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فيه ولولا ذلك سقط عدلهما وكان في سقوط عدلهما سقوط روايتهما وحاشا لله عز وجل يكون كذلك ولكنهما على عدلهما وعلى أنهما لم يتركا ما سمعاه من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إلا إلى ما سمعاه منه مما قال بعده. So you can see over and over he's looking, the first step, we're quoting so many statements where he's saying that the first step is Jama, but over and over we find that he's looking at the statement of the Sahabi. Now not only the Sahabi, even the Tabi'i, he looks at his statement. So you will find in Sharh Mushkil al-Athar he says فَعَقَلْنَا بِذَلِكَ أَنَّ عُرْوَةَ مع جلالة قدره وموضعه من العلم. So عروة, right? مع جلالة قدره وموضعه من العلم لم يدع ما في ذلك عنده عن عائشة أو عن عبد الله بن الزبير عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إلى ما يخالفه إلا وقد ثبت نسخ ذلك عنه لأنه لو لم يكن الأمر كذلك لسقط بذلك عدله وإذا سقط عدله سقطت روايته. So you can see also if a tabi'i practiced in contrast to what he is narrating. That was Urwa. At another place he says وهذا الشعبي وعليه دار هذا الحديث قد قال ما رويناه عنه في الحديث الأول فدل ذلك على أنه لم يقله إلا وقد ثبت عنده نسخ ما في الحديث الأول. So here he is calling this here nas, that when a Sahabi is practicing or even a Tabi'i is practicing in contrast to what they're narrating, he's calling it nas. So the second, the first and second group are looking at this words that he's using. He's and they are then saying that the first step we take is nas. But then, and then you know that Imam Tahawi, so we quoted all those other statements. But in Sharh Mushkil al-Athar, so many times he says, ثُمَّ نَظَرْنَا هَلْ رُوِيَ عَنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. So the minute we find 2 contradictory reports, ثُمَّ نَظَرْنَا هَلْ رُوِيَ عَنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم مَا يَنْسَخُ ذَلِكَ أَمْ لَا. He did not say, ثُمَّ نَظَرْنَا كيف نجمع بين هذه الروايات. He's not saying that we look how can we combine these riwayat. The first step which he's mentioning is ما ينسخ ذلك أم لا. So keeping all that in mind, Now we can understand Mulana Ni'matullah Azmi when he said that these are laws which are mentioned. ولكن ذلك ليس بمضطرد فإنا نرى كثيرا من العلماء الذين يقدمون النسخ على الترجيح تركوا القول بالنسخ في كثير من المسائل المبنية على الأحاديث المختلفة المعلومة تقدم بعضها على الآخر كما نرى كثيرا من العلماء القائلين بتقديم الجمع حكموا عليها بالنسخ مع إمكان الجمع بينهما بوجوه. So these are laws which are mentioned in books of usul. It just mentioned that you give preference to nasakh and then give preference to jama, etc. But at times they will leave out this, and also there are a whole lot of steps before even coming to this. Now, once we understood all of this here, the Hanafi madhab, now let's come to the commentaries of Nuzha an-Naḍar and see what the Hanafi ulama have said when looking at the text of Ibn Hajar rahimahullah. So Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, not Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, Ibn al-Hanbali rahimahullah, he mentions the Hanafi view in Al-Far' al-Athith and also in Qaf al-Athar, but we go from Al-Far' al-Athith. It's based on Qaf al-Athar. He says, وَلِذَا قِيلَ فِي أُصُولِنَا إِنْ كَانَ التَّعَرُّض أي ظاهرا بين آيتين أو قراءتين أو سنتين أو بين آية وسنة في قوتها كالمشهور والمتواتر فإن علم المتأخر منهما أي صريحا فناسخ. So you can see he's starting off with nas, but we explained that there are steps before that. وإلا فإن أمكن الجمع بينهما باعتبار مخلص من الحكم أو المحل أو الزمان. So you can see this here. باعتبار مخلص من الحكم أو المحل أو الزمان is something which we should have explained in more detail but because of time we could not go into all of that. How Ibn al-Hanbali rahmallah mentioned, and now you can understand in an-Naḍar when they mention there that واختلف عبارات علمائنا الحنفية, and then after he gives the Hanafi, he quotes from أصول السرخسي. So quoting from أصول السرخسي, he says فأما بيان المخلص عن المعارضات فنقول يطلب أولا هذا المخلص من نفس الحجة. So from all of this you can see, although they are mentioning that there are so many different views within the Hanafi madhab and there are so many different steps within the Hanafi madhab and they are contradictory, but ultimately it's all coming down to the same thing. It's all depending on how you are looking at it, whether you are looking at steps before you can say that there is ta'aruz, or whether from the very beginning you are looking at ta'aruz. And this is how we explained it. All these mutaakhirun, they derived it from the mutaqaddimun, and the mutaqaddimun, they have clear statements, but we also can see from the actions. So depending on what lenses you put, that is how they would approach it. Inshallah, in the next lesson we'll continue at the kitab. Until then, jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.